Witam wszystkich, którzy do nas się dziś w ten mroźny wieczór wybrali. To jest ostatnia już debata, tutaj muszę kilka słów powiedzieć na początku. To jest ostatnia debata z serii Kryzys zaufania w Europie. My organizujemy te debaty jako kultura liberalna z siecią Time to Talk. Materiały z debat, które organizuje ta sieć europejska, organizacji, które prowadzą debaty, jest dostępna online, wspiera cały projekt Open Society Foundation. No i wcześniejsze debaty były powiązane tematycznie oczywiście z dzisiejszym spotkaniem. Pierwsza debata dotyczyła kryzysu zaufania do polityków, druga debata dotyczyła kryzysu zaufania młodych do pokolenia starszych, wreszcie trzecia debata dotyczyła zaufania do cudzoziemców. Dzisiejsza debata jest debatą, która poniekąd puentuje te wcześniejsze rozważania, bo będziemy rozmawiać o kryzysie zaufania społeczeństwa do państwa. I naszymi tutaj wśród gości mamy osoby znakomite. Jako pierwszego gościa wymienię naszego gościa, który przyjechał specjalnie z Wielkiej Brytanii na ten wieczór, Adrian Wooldridge, dziennikarz The Economist, redaktor rubryki Schumpeter, współautor książki Czwarta rewolucja, którą tutaj można zobaczyć, która niebawem się ma ukazać w języku polskim. I także nasi wspaniali goście, profesor Ewa Łętowska,
leśna babcia,
znakomita prawniczka, była rzecznik praw obywatelskich, sędzia Trybunału Konstytucyjnego i pani profesor już zapowiedziała, że będzie gorąco. Tak jest. Pani profesor Anna Giza, socjolożka, prorektor do spraw rozwoju i polityki finansowej Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego, także współpracująca w trzecim sektorze, w związku z tym tutaj będzie pełne pole do popisu, aby zadać kilka interesujących pytań. No i wreszcie wspaniały gość, profesor Joanna Tyrowicz, ekonomistka, która jest starszą ekonomistką w Instytucie Ekonomicznym NBP i co jakiś czas zaskakuje nas raportami, z których wynika, że powinniśmy myśleć inaczej niż do tej pory myślimy, a przynajmniej zmienić sposób dyskusji. Jak rozumiem, Wydział Nauk Ekonomicznych też jest tu reprezentowany w osobie pani profesor. A zatem przechodzimy tutaj do naszej debaty. Już tylko kończąc, chciałbym podziękować osobom, które nam pomogły. Elżbieta Ber, Tomasz Sawczuk, Piotr Szymański, Jania Olmińska. Podziękowania także dla Grzegorza Brzozowskiego, który tutaj nam zapewnia obsługę na płaszczyźnie audiowizualnej. No i jeśli chodzi o język debaty, to tutaj w zasadzie dla każdego coś miłego, to znaczy jeżeli będą pytania z sali, to Państwo mogą je zadawać w języku angielskim albo polskim, bo rozumiem, że na to się tutaj możemy wszyscy zgodzić. Nasz gość ma zapewnione tłumaczenie, jak Państwo widzą, dyskretne, natomiast my będziemy prowadzić tę debatę od czasu do czasu, mieszając języki.
And since I know that there are some people in the audience who speak only English, to sum it up, that was an introduction, but the main point is that if you want to ask questions, you can ask them in English. The debate will be held both English and Polish, so every panelist will use their own language, but you can ask the questions as you wish, whatever language you choose.
Będziemy się poprawiać w czasie tej debaty na pewno, ale najważniejsze jednak jest oczywiście to, o czym będziemy rozmawiać, a punktem wyjścia i powodem, dla którego zaprosiliśmy naszego gościa z renomowanego pisma The Economist, jest oczywiście kwestia państwa i jest oczywiście kwestia tego, jak my możemy sobie spojrzeć na nasze dyskusje o państwie, w szczególności o te dyskusje, bo po ćwierćwieczu, jak widać, nastąpi pewien zwrot w myśleniu o państwie. Poprzednie pokolenia zadawały sobie pytanie w ogóle, po co państwo, tak? Zadawały sobie pytania w 1989, do czego im potrzebne jest to państwo. W 25 roku III Rzeczypospolitej dyskusja, jak widać, uległa zmianie. Rozmawiamy już w innej tonacji. Jak widać, pojawiły się inne problemy. Ale rozmowę o państwie, żeby troszeczkę ten nasz dialog gorący wpisać w inny kontekst, ta rozmowa prowadzona jest na całym świecie. W istocie o tym jest książka i to będzie nasze pierwsze pytanie, żeby wpisać się trochę w ten szerszy kontekst, a potem będziemy zadawać pytania i próbować spotkać się z tymi dyskusjami o państwie, bo jednak sporo inspiracji płynie z zagranicy dla naszych oczekiwań wobec państwa. Zapytamy naszego gościa, what was the purpose of your book? What had you in mind while writing the book, if you could say us?
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me here. This is my first ever visit to Poland, so thank you. This book was really a counterblast against three sorts of people. The one is conservatives, right-wingers, who say that the state doesn't matter, that the only thing to do with the state is, as one American conservative said, shrink it to such a size that it can be easily drowned in a bathtub. And I think that if you believe that, then you ought to spend the rest of your life in Congo or in Somalia or something like that. Those are countries that have no state or fragile, broken states. The state matters. Secondly, it was a counterblast to liberals and socialists who think that the state is something that needs simply to be protected against people who want to dismantle it, who think that any service, any automatically always defended and justified in its own terms. I think that they're wrong. The state is too big, too badly designed, and has failed to adjust to a world of very different new technologies. The third group of people that the book was designed to deal with, ordinary people, voters, who I think have a mood of discordant apathy about the state. They don't like the state. They go out to vote against governments. We've just seen in the United States people voting for the Republicans, essentially because they don't like Obama in the midterm elections. We saw in the European Union elections people voting in huge numbers against established parties because they don't like the way established parties work. So there's a mood of hostility towards public political elites, but I don't think that that mood ever goes along with a really constructive sense that the state might change dramatically. People want to kick the state, but they don't really want to revolutionize it. What we argue in this book is two things. Firstly, that it would be perverse to imagine changes that we're seeing ripping through the private sector, changing the private sector because of information technology, will not also fundamentally change the public sector. And secondly, that if you look at the history of the state, it's been a history of very dramatic changes. From the 16th century onwards, the state has changed its function, and it's changed to address three very different questions. If you look at what is the state for, in the 16th century, it's really about Hobbesian issues of providing security. If you look at the 18th and 19th century, it's really about liberal, John Stuart Mill style issues of providing accountability, liberty. If you look at most of the 20th century, it's quite often been about providing welfare, minimum welfare arrangements. So the state has dramatically changed over the years.
And mainly the conclusions for the especially for the young generation that is much interested in the state issue. What if you could just make the basic guidelines?
Well, our conclusion in this book basically is the state matters. The state needs to be reformed, but it's making a very bad job of it at the moment. And that for most of the post-war era, we've had a sense of the world's democracies winning the race for creating a good state. And from 1945 to 2000, we basically saw democracy on the march around the world, obviously in the former Soviet Empire, obviously in Latin America. And since the year 2000, we've seen democracy really slowing down. Russia has reversed away from what the democratic experiment as it was. Democracy has been a disaster in the Middle East. The European Union is not something which people find very inspiring. It's quite often very undemocratic in the way it operates. American democracy has become, I think, very flabby, very self-indulgent. The United States constantly fails to pass a budget. At the same time, the authoritarian model that the Chinese have developed has been going from success to success. It's been going from economic success, in that they've had about 7 to 10% growth. They've also managed to create a sort of autocratic regime that combines a changing of elites. Every 10 years, you get a new elite, a new government, a new set of political actors being put in place. So they have the circulation of elites, which democracy is supposed to provide, without disorder, without the sort of breakdown that you saw in Russia in the late 1990s. So the comparative advantage of democracy, the comparative advantage of liberal regimes has declined in the 21st century. And I think one of the main reasons for that, is that democracy in the West has become too flabby, too self-indulgent, too poorly organized, too fat. The state tries to do too many things, does many of those things badly. And so the race that we talk about to reinvent the state is a race between two models. It's the autocratic Chinese model on the one hand, the Western democratic model on the other hand, and we need to overhaul, shrink, and modernize the state, not just because that's a better way of providing services, but that's the only way in which the liberal democratic ideal will survive this new challenge from the East. I mean, by the East, I mean China, essentially, but Singapore as well.
And in the book, you discuss many different areas, from education to healthcare, social security. But one of the issues we discuss here in Poland a lot is education. So my first question is to Professor Anna Giza. Pani profesor, no pani reprezentuje uniwersytet także jako władza tego uniwersytetu. Reprezentuje pani uniwersytet no wciąż uważany za jeden z 2 najlepszych w Polsce, ale jest to uniwersytet publiczny, a my wiemy skądinąd, że najlepsze uczelnie na świecie, takie jak choćby uczelnie amerykańskie, to są uczelnie prywatne, które są od rządu całkowicie niezależne, i te uniwersytety stanowe w Stanach Zjednoczonych no, daleko odbiegają od tych prywatnych, takie jak Harvard, Yale, Princeton i tak dalej. Więc pytanie jest następujące. Czy w związku z tym edukacja wyższa powinna pozostać publiczna w Polsce? Jeżeli tak, to czego my od państwa możemy oczekiwać i ewentualnie jak zmieniać te uniwersytety, żebyśmy w tych szanghajskich rankingach byli trochę wyżej, a nie w 3. czy 4. setce?
To już za chwilę będzie gorąco.
Tam jest mikrofon.
Proszę, pani profesor.
Dziękuję bardzo. I'm not sure whether I should speak Polish or English, but
It's up to you.
it's up to me. So let me try English, although it's 6 o'clock in the evening and I'm not sure whether I can find all words that I need. Coffee would do, really, would be very nice. But basically I would like to start with the remark that what I will try to say is a kind of 2-in-1, because I believe after 2 years that university is state in miniature. So all problems and all crises that we can see, that we can watch in the domain of state, they also university. But trying to address your question before I go to more details into why I believe university is like a state. I would say that, of course, this is not only the question about what we wish, but also the question of what we can do. When we think about Polish constitution and when we think about our history, it's absolutely obvious that education for the time being will stay public issue in Poland, if only for the very reason that in the constitution we claim that education is open, public and free for citizens. But I also do believe listening to certain discussions in the West that education as such is a kind of the most important public good that is to be delivered in a way that serves best our common goals and our common values. So from that point of view, I believe that it should stay public in this sense, that it can answer the challenges and the issues that are important for all of us. If I have concerns about what's happening to education in Poland, I would start with the, I think, very true observation that we have never talked We have never discussed in Poland what are the goals of higher education in Poland. So we try to change the law and we try many reforms, but nobody answered the question, what are we trying to achieve having universities? I see that you would like to add that we want to have a bigger percentage of people with higher education, but of course it is not the answer to this question.
I just would like to add that I've got the impression that we are asking the question almost all the time, and from time to time we receive an answer, but it's surprising to hear that nobody has found the answer to this big question. Maybe just the question is too big. Maybe it's just the question should be asked to the main universities.
It is not to be asked to the universities, it has to be asked to public authorities, because they are shaping the education policy in Poland. And depending on that education policy, we have certain consequences that are very negative and that do not serve Polish universities. Of course, I am aware that our milieu, let us say, is not also very efficient in forming goals of the higher education. But if I look through the documents that, like for example, the strategy for the higher education in Poland, I can't find any reasonable answer to the very question, what are we trying to achieve? Do we really wish to have 43%, if I remember properly, people with higher education, and what for? And what higher education means? Whether higher education means just, a kind of the civilization competencies and skills that make us belonging to the civilized world, or is it about really having professional specialist knowledge, or what? And I think these are the questions that have never been seriously answered, but also they have never been properly discussed. I have very often the impression that we are playing the game, or the blame game even, between universities and government. They try to change the law to force us to do something, then we find a kind of the bypass not to do that or to do that differently, then they make the novel of the law to again, and I will give you very simple example, like for example the way PhD students are counted in the famous algorithm, which of course cost all universities to increase the number of PhD students, which resulted in a ministry changing the way PhD students are calculated in the algorithm, which resulted in universities doing other things. And I think that this kind of the game lead us nowhere.
But what would be your answer to this question?
To the question of what we need higher education to?
Yeah. Where are we now with
higher education? I think that we need higher education to increase the ability identify and to develop talents that are in our society. That we need higher education to create the space for people to innovate, experiment with their abilities. Because I understand that schools of lower rank, so to say, are more about learning basic things, and higher education should be really about trying your brain, trying your abilities, trying, experimenting with various things. I believe that this is about playing with our minds, and this is what higher education should be for. It's not about only learning the state of science in the world, which of course is very important, but this is about autonomous thinking, about how do you say it, make a kind of the brain training, It should be, and I will only make one remark. What is the most sad thing for me personally is that universities are less and less joyful, if you understand what I mean. You know, I enter the room and I see people suffering, sitting like zombie and waiting till the end. I believe that universities should be about passion and should be about the joy that every human being finds in discovering things. And they are not. They are about KRK.
So, last question, very, very simple yes or no question. So, do you think these goals can be better addressed if the universities were private or public or state-funded or private-funded?
They are both risky, so let me be very Machiavellic and say that mixed would be the best option. But basically what I have in mind is that, of course, we can't expect that industry and business and private money will be given for playfully, using your mind. And we know a lot of examples that it is risky and it leads to certain corruption, let us say, in of course, brackets. Yeah. So I'm not sure, but it was believed that it's very difficult to produce high quality public goods for private money. You know, that market cannot produce these kind of things. And of course, public money are also quite risky because then I am not only thinking about famous law concerning public finance, which is of course a kind of the corset for universities, and all money are either round or square and it's very difficult to find them, but also public institutions are not very innovative by their nature. So basically, I think that a kind of the mixed formula would be best.
A quick comment from our guest, and then the question.
I just wanted to say that I think a lot of discussion about universities are rather like discussions in 1900 about the horseless carriage and the future of the horseless carriage. I think that universities are going to change as much in the next 10 years as they have in the previous 150 years, because the capacity of the internet, of high technology, of all these computers that we have to deliver education in a vivid and user-controllable manner is going to be dramatic. It's already dramatically improved in the last few years, but it will dramatically improve in the next 10 years. So I think we have to understand that the technology is simply going to transform this sector beyond comprehension, beyond our expectations, really.
Pani profesor, ja aż się boję zadać pytanie, bo pani profesor już w zasadzie widzę, że ma strój do tego, co zostało powiedziane. Więc ja może tylko dodam, że pani profesor swoje opinie dość wyraziste opinie zaprezentowała w znakomitym wywiadzie Rzeka Rzeźbienie państwa prawa i tam wiele można się było dowiedzieć na temat podsumowania III RP. Ale rozumiem, że
komentarz... tylko o Trybunale Konstytucyjnym, ale to było tylko o Trybunale Konstytucyjnym, ale jeżeli można, nie tracąc czasu, odwołując się, bo tak, pan zaprezentował wizję demokracji w głębokim kryzysie, co jest oczywiste. Tu mamy prezentację, co zrobić ze sektorem szkół wyższych. A ja proponuję zejść jeszcze niżej. Dlatego, że problem kryzysu w Polsce, który jest odbiciem tego, co jest na Zachodzie, ma swoje własne cechy. A ja jestem prawnik, czyli ja jestem technik. W związku z tym ja formułuję sądy pragmatyczne. Nie potrafię powiedzieć, co należy zrobić w skali globalnej. Nie mam zielonego pojęcia. Natomiast wiem jedno, to co się dzieje w Polsce. I pani rektor się odwoływała do kwestii prawa, zmian prawa. Kilka razy tutaj to padło. Proszę państwa, Milovan Djilas 60 lat temu, za mojej młodości, zrobił sensację, kiedy przedstawił establishmentowi, który wierzył propagandzie, która mówiła, że rządzi lud pracujący miast i wsi, powiedział, że rządzi oligarchia partyjna. To są dosyć oczywiste. W tej chwili mamy problem, my mamy Gillasa, tylko my o tym nie wiemy, mamy Gillasowską sytuację, tylko o tym nie wiemy. Nam się wydaje, że prawo robi parlament. Nam się wydaje, że prawo robi, jeżeli jest delegowany, minister. Nieprawda, proszę państwa. Robi oligarchia biurokratyczna, skupiona w ministeriach, skupiona w parlamencie. I co mogę powiedzieć ja, wiedząc o prawie, bo tylko o tym mogę mówić, że jest to niezwykle niski poziom fachowy, bo to nie jest prawda, to co mówi się w dyskusjach liberalnych, jakoby prawo zawsze pożerało wolność. Prawo czasami jest sługą wolności, ponieważ jej dodaje. Przykład. Jeżeli są różnego rodzaju figury ułatwiające obrót finansowy, zabezpieczenia, poręczenia, pożyczki, to są figury prawne. Co one robią? Ograniczają? Nie. Ułatwiają ludziom osiągnięcie ich celów finansowych, gospodarczych. Nie chcę państwa zanudzać prawniczeniem, ale problemem jest to, że instrumentarium prawne, zarówno używane w Europie przez prawo unijne, jak i to, które jest dostępne w książkach prawniczych, jest bardzo bogate. My o tym nie mamy zielonego pojęcia. Przykład konkretny z tych dni. Jest w parlamencie. Kłócą się obrońcy przyrody z doświadczalnikami na temat ochrony zwierząt doświadczalnych. Spór jest w wielu punktach, wynika stąd, że jedni i drudzy nie wiedzą, do jakich instrumentów prawnych sięgnąć, aby osiągnąć swoje cele. Znów Gillas się kłania. Dawniej było tak, że urzędnik państwowy rozstrzygał o spornych interesach ludzi, którzy przychodzili po decyzję tego urzędnika. W tej chwili wygodny urzędnik ministerialny lub w parlamencie woli wykreować organ partycypacyjny z dwóch grup interesów po to, że sam nie robi, a jednocześnie jest bardzo demokratyczny. Ochrońcy zwierząt i doświadczalnicy działają zatem w komisjach etycznych, w proporcjach określonych. Jeżeli nie ma parytetu, to wtedy jeden interes przeważa nad drugim. Ale o zgodę na doświadczenia występują tylko doświadczalnicy. Oni ewentualnie dostaną decyzję negatywną, to się odwołają. Ale jeżeli dostaną decyzję pozytywną, to się nie odwołają, bo dostali co chcieli. W związku z tym przez kreację organu partycypacyjnego, a nie neutralnego, mamy sytuację, w której interes przyrody jest niechroniony w gruncie rzeczy. Kiedy usiłowałam wytłumaczyć, że w takiej sytuacji nie należy wpisywać do konstytucji, do ustawy, żeby zwierzętom było dobrze, a nam się żyło dostatniej, to oczywiście nikt nie rozumiał, że jeżeli proponuje wpisanie określonej procedury, która ma określone gwarancje, to te cele, które chcą osiągnąć ci, którzy zmierzają do ochrony przyrody, będą osiągnięte. Tylko co ja mam robić, jak oni powiadają, że tego nie rozumieją? I proszę państwa, to nie jest anegdota. W wielu wypadkach, to co mówi pani rektor, my mamy do czynienia z kompletnym zaćmieniem sceny przez niewłaściwe używanie narzędzi. Odwołując się do wielkich dyskusji, już kończę, do wielkich dyskusji pomiędzy liberałami i no, ja wiem, socjalistami, niech będzie. Prawo nie zawsze ogranicza wolność, ale trzeba wiedzieć, do którego narzędzia prawnego sięgnąć. Obniżenie poziomu. Powiedziałam, że jestem leśną babcią według współczesnej nomenklatury. Otóż mam 74 lata. Proszę Państwa, za moich czasów poziom urzędników państwowych był wyższy, przynajmniej niektórych.
To Elżbieta Bieńkowska powiedziała coś innego, że tam brukselska administracja jest na poziomie administracji polskiej z lat 90., co by sugerowało, że administracja polska współcześnie stoi gdzieś wyżej. Rozumiem, że pani profesor się nie zgadza z tym bon motem.
Mnie jest trudno się odnieść bezpośrednio do tego twierdzenia. Ja natomiast twierdzę, że w tej chwili generalny poziom, mainstream załatwiania spraw, na skutek zresztą trudności związanych z prawem europejskim, bo to jest bardzo trudne, opadł. Dalej mamy problem z sądami, ale to już jest zupełnie inna historia. Sumując.
Czyli jest gorzej, tak?
Jest gorzej przynajmniej w moim sektorze, gdy idzie o prawo. Przy czym chcę Państwu powiedzieć, że to nie jest kwestia mojego wieku, tylko to jest kwestia niewydolności we współczesnych warunkach i trudności związanych z prawem europejskim narzędzi, które są używane przez klasę próżniaczą. Dziękuję.
A liczba biurokratów w ostatnich latach wzrosła dramatycznie, więc mimo tego przyrostu jest
ale bo
mniej...
się potykają o własne nogi. Więc musi być ich więcej, żeby no oni nie umieją zrobić dobrze, więc wytwarzają dużo papierów. Ja się żachnęłam na rankingi. Proszę Państwa, od czasu wprowadzenia, mam wrażenie, że pani profesor potwierdzi, dawniej była dyskusja naukowa, w związku z tym publikowało się ostatecznie sprawozdanie z dyskusji. W tej chwili dyskusja się rozbija na tyle kawałków, ile było dyskutantów i każdy robi punktowany artykuł do marnego czasopisma.
Pani profesor Giza chciała się odnieść do tego.
Tak, ja chciałam tylko powiedzieć jedno zdanie, bo wydaje mi się, że to, co pani profesor powiedziała, jest naprawdę niezwykle ważne. Ja mam wrażenie, nie jestem prawnikiem, że prawo w Polsce jest używane do dekretowania rzeczywistości zamiast do tworzenia mechanizmów, które sprzyjają osiąganiu celów. Innymi słowy, w prawie dokładnie mówimy, żeby przyroda była szczęśliwa, a zwierzęta się uśmiechały, a nie projektujemy niejako, prawda, instrumenty i narzędzia, które sprawią, że zwierzęta zaczną się uśmiechać same z siebie. I to jest chyba podstawowy problem.
To...
To Joanna Cyrowicz, because both in Poland as abroad, we have this discussion about what people actually expect from the state as they go. And in Poland, we have these two different narratives. On the one hand, we learn that the Poles are these old Homo Sovieticus who somehow are dependent on the state and wanted to provide all their services there. On the other hand, we hear that Poles are egoists and would like the state to be minimal, to be the night watchman. How do you? What comes out from your research, and do you think that this opposition is still legitimate? And how does it change with new generations coming in and growing up in Poland after 1989?
So I'm standing in for my president of the board, Professor Marek Berska, whose views are widely known also because he was prime minister in this country, so he was able to express practically a lot of his views on reality. But I will not try to speak in his name, I'll rather speak in mine. So first, for an economist, the question whether democracy is in retreat and whether it's an efficient way to satisfy the needs of the society is a discussion I think we have solved about 100 years ago. So basically what we prefer is called central planning as opposed to decentralized equilibrium. And any model we do and develop as economists, we show that decentralized equilibrium doesn't make use of all the possible externalities that are there. So if externalities are negative, there's too much of bad things. If externalities are positive, there's too little of good things, and you need a central planner to step in and adjust. And that's very simple. And then on the practical side, we look at the data, we look at the world and say it's really hard to find an enlightened authoritarian. It's easy to find an authoritarian, but it's much harder to find an enlightened authoritarian. Given these constraints, most of economics relies on market mechanics, not because this is what economists like per se, but because we know well in models and in empirics how to address the problem of externalities. A simple example of externality is what involves a public good. Assuming education would be a public good, which is not necessarily granted, but assuming education would be a public good, standard economic models would say if people were to pay for it privately, there would be too little educated people, because we also have benefits not only from our own education, but also education of the peers, people around us. So I would invest in my own skills, but not necessarily in the skills of the others. And if that holds, there would be too little educated people. And I would have individually too little payoff from that. Now, the problem is that practically education isn't necessarily a public good. It's a partly private good and a partly public one. It's private to the extent to which we enter, for example, in a classroom. There is only a certain number of people that can fit in the room, and of those who can fit in the room, only a certain number is eligible. For example, they enrolled into university and completed all their classes. So practically, education is what we call a club good. Only people allowed to a club can participate and benefit from it. Now, given these, this is just an example of why the externalities problem cannot be solved easily in the practical world. Now, because it's not a purely public good, there comes in a regulator called the state. He tries to do a central planning rather than decentralized equilibrium, and he bumps into a problem. It's not a purely public good. It's a partly club good. So we create all these things like rankings and so on to overcome the problem that a public good isn't purely a public one. Now, having given a short lecture on basic economics and explaining an obvious things, which is like it's easy to find an authoritarian and how to find it, I'll try to answer the question of what's changed. And I very much subscribe to everything that Professor Łętowska has said, but I'll go away from bureaucracy, administration, and public administration, try to answer the question Łukasz formulated, which is, what's changed now? I'm not a sociologist, I'm a very simple economist, so I don't know what is Homo Sovieticus. I don't know also what is a liberal egoist or whatever other name you used. We also, of course, know what is Homo economicus, but we're not stupid enough to think people are Homo economicus. So that, I think, is solved. Now, what is new, and that's striking for me, over the last month, I think I've participated in like 10 debates with young people, and every time we finish talking, there's questions from the room. And it was the first, the second, and the third that struck me, and then fourth, I was pretty much prepared for it. What happens is that people know rather than ask. They have certain view, and that view doesn't need merits. That view is very strongly rooted into them. Like people who believe animals should be free will fight for that, aside the merits. People who believe experiments should be allowed will fight for that, aside the merits. And there's so little individuals. I'm not even saying any of them is public administration, but there's so few individuals that are interested in any evidence in support of any of these two views. That basically, even if you have evidence, so even if you're able to fundraise some money and do any decent research, even if you have any evidence, it's so hard to explain to anybody what it is and how it can be used for formulating policy, and then perhaps evaluating it as well, that is basically wasted effort. So what's changed from my perspective, and that's something my experience doesn't go as much back as President Tusk, but even if I go back in my experience was we went to debates or classes or whatever, and we formulated questions. Now I come to debates on the other side, and what I hear is people's views about the world. Now everybody's entitled, of course, to their own view. And what I'm right now saying is not economic, it's sociological, but whatever. Everybody's entitled to their own view. The problem becomes when the view isn't only something we express with the ballots or in public polls or whatever, but when it becomes something we express when performing our public activities, such as being government officials, such as being members of parliament, such as being let's just say, voicing in stakeholders for a lot of issues that are out there. And that's, I think, where I would like to stop.
So I'll ask you another question, because you perform a lot of experiments, like in economics, but you also advise the state. And from what I know, or try to influence public administration. And from what I know from conversations with you, I know that you quite often stumble upon like the wall, and that you cannot break through with your advice. Where do you think the problem is? Is it that the people are simply more used to their views and they don't want to change it, or how do you describe it? Because you told me a couple of times that you present evidence to public administration. You want a policy to be changed. For example, when we talked on inequalities, you said that we introduce policies to tackle inequality, but then nobody checks the results. Where is the reason behind that?
So let's just say that any influence I ever tried to make on policy was mistakes of youth, and I'm already not that young. Not going back that road. But I think this is, like when we say democracy or global issues or whatever, there is a huge difference, and it's substantial, in the quality of lawmaking and policy making in even advanced countries. So if we take the British example, you can complain a lot about how much failing that state is, but that state invests a lot of effort to knowing itself how it's failing. It's not always taking that into account in formulating new policy, because we know politics matter and so on. But in terms of self-evaluation, it's a standard operating procedure to do that. It's a standard operating procedure not to do that in Poland. It's rather exceptions than the rule that anybody looks at the effects of the policy they did, which is a factual statement, not a view statement. But if I were to understand what is actually the question you're asking me, like why don't they do it? Because they don't need to. There is nothing that forces them.
There is no accountability.
There's no accountability, and I mean when they don't.
Or maybe there is no good viewpoint on the issue. You know, the opinion background. You know, maybe that's the reason they do not know why they should do it.
They,
you know.
So right now it's again an interpretation.
That's what I try to refer to the book, because you, Adrian Uldrich, you give a lot of not only incentives but also some suggestions what should be done in the administration. If you could add something, because I think that the problem is pretty universal.
If I could just one sentence. So you have a view as a policymaker, and on the other side there's a person that has a view as well, and nobody has merits. So who cares what you have to say? You're in the power position, you decide. Then somebody else wins the election, they're in power position, they decide. It's a simple game, it's a power game, not a merit game.
Okay.
Yeah, my answer to that question is I think that we've reached a certain impasse with the state that if you go back throughout the 20th century, the notion of the state that became embodied in practice from about the year 1900 onwards was that the state should provide people with a minimum of education, of healthcare, of welfare. The welfare state became the sort of working model. And that model worked for a very long period of time. It provided higher living standards, it provided a set of securities, a set of opportunities which were very valuable to people, which people valued highly. That Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, said to people that you've never had it so good. And that was true in many ways. The state managed to engineer consistent economic growth and provide a whole series of valuable goods to people. But something went wrong in about the 1970s throughout much of the West, whereby the state begins to produce less and less for more and more investment. You get economic stagnation, you get the war on poverty, poverty wins the war on poverty. You get the war on crime, crime wins the war on crime. You get sort of a general economic malaise. And you get an attempt to discipline the state, to bring it back to its original functions with Thatcher, with Reagan, with a whole series of reforming politicians. And that works for a while. But I think what we've seen recently is the state has continued to grow, it's continued to sprawl, take on too many responsibilities, and it's continued to fail. And what we need now to do is to reform the state in order that it can work better. We have to do it because of fundamental economic facts, that we no longer have the money that we had before. We're running a perpetual deficit. I think America has balanced its budget 5 times since 1960. France has not managed to balance its budget since 1974. The whole Keynesian demand management thing was supposed to be a solution to a unique recession. And what it's become is standard day-to-day operating procedure all the time. And I don't think that can go on anymore, partly because the financial system is too fragile, but partly because the demography, the structure of the population is changing. The baby boomers are getting older. The number of people who have to be supported by a smaller and smaller population is growing up, is going up. So the economist Herb Stein once said that if something can't go on, it will stop. And I think that is true of this perpetual deficit financing. So I think we have to change the way that we're running the state. But also, I think there's some good news as well. And the good news is that we can change it. We can run the state much better. We can learn from the way that the private sector manages itself and manage the state better. In the private sector, everything is measured. You constantly measure how well you're performing. And in the public sector, we haven't been measuring things. So people will always say, if they don't get the results that they want, there's not enough spending. We need to spend more money. Now we have things like the PISA results, in which indeed Poland does extremely well, which show that there's actually a very, very tenuous relationship between how much money you spend and what sort of results you get. That Poland spends much, much less money per child than California does, and gets consistently better results. So simply by measuring things, we can begin to improve things. But also by having contracting out, by having competition, you can iron out differences in performance that you see in the public sector all the time. In the private sector, if there's a big difference in performance between one factory and another factory, those differences are rapidly competed away. Firms will become as efficient as each other. That could happen in the public sector if we make more use of contracting out, more use of competition, more use of comparison. So I think just by managing things better, measuring, competing, we can improve the performance of the public sector. But finally, the reason why I'm actually relatively optimistic about the potential for the future of the state is that we're seeing now an information technology revolution that is as dramatic for the service sector as the industrial revolution of the 19th century was for the manufacturing sector. That we can see a dramatic improvement in productivity. Economists have tended to think that we cannot improve the productivity of the service sector. William Baumol talks about Baumol's disease. He says that in order to have a string quartet playing, you need 4 people. That's Baumol's disease. So productivity must remain flat. But in fact, I can listen on my stereo system to a string quartet, and it's pretty good. It's not that different from going to a concert. In fact, I don't have to listen to the coughing. I don't have to get out of my house. In fact, because of Spotify, I can listen to all the music that has ever been made in the history of the world on my system for a very, very small fee. And I think that sort of productivity revolution in the service sector is going to completely change productivity of education, of healthcare, of bureaucracy, because we can now do, because of information technology, we can incredibly, massively increase the productivity of workers. So the sort of things that you're seeing with Google, with basically putting the world's information at your fingertips, creating driverless cars, creating a world in which we basically have access to all the world's information, something which seemed inconceivable in 1999. That revolution is going to come to the private sector, to the public sector, very, very quickly. The way that universities operate, the way that schools operate, the way that hospitals operate is going to be revolutionized by this technology, which is improving very, very quickly. And so we will be able to have an industrial revolution for the service sector, for the public sector.
But what gives you the optimism? Because in the book there is an example when the public sector was computerized and old typewriters were replaced with computers, which was supposed to boost productivity and to lower the cost of public administration. And then it turned out that the new computers were used simply as typewriters, but new models of typewriters, and nothing really changed. You give you also the data for how much it costs to collect tax revenue in Britain, and despite the growth in the number of in public administrations, the costs remain relatively the same. So why do you think now it's going to change?
I think somebody once said that we tend to overestimate the impact of new technology in the short term and underestimate the impact of new technology in the long term. And the way that new technology essentially manifested itself at first was huge computer systems put in by central planners, Homo Sovieticus, trying to plan everything, and with consultancies making huge amounts of money out of doing that. And that's not improved productivity, it's not changed things. But what we're now seeing is that everybody has a supercomputer in their pocket. Everybody has an iPad, everybody has an iPhone. We have distributed intelligence all around the world. And it's this thing, the empowerment of individuals, not the empowerment of bureaucrats with HAL, with their own computers, but the empowerment of individuals that is going to change the nature of the state. It's going to allow us all to measure, to know how efficient the state is, and it's going to provide us all with access to all sorts of information. We don't have to go and listen to... When I was at university many years ago, I remember going to listen to some lectures on medieval history. I don't know why I did that, it's not very interesting. But the lecturer would stand there and he would talk for an hour. He would read out a yellowing piece of paper, and he would put each piece of paper behind the previous one, and then he got to the end and started again, coughing after every sentence. We don't have to be subjected to that now, because we can watch on our iPads the best lecturer in the world, giving the best lecture in the world for nothing, free. So the service sector is going through a dramatic set of changes, and in 10 years' time, we will be living in a different world. Massive increases in productivity. So I think that, you know, it's going to be a good period for something that has been mired in tradition, conservatism, inertia, and lack of change. We're going to see some really dramatic change very, very soon. In fact, we're living through it now.
And to hit it even up, what's your attitude toward privatization?
In the university sector, we were talking about universities, public and private universities. I think actually basically a lot of private universities are basically like public universities, but with more money, in the sense that they've been very, very resistant to change. And I think the big problem is that you have a guild of very self-protecting, uninnovative people who run universities, whether they're public or private. But that model will not be sustained in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Pani profesor chciała od razu coś skomentować, tak? Prosimy.
Ten nowy, wspaniały świat, który na pewno osiągniemy dzięki postępowi technicznemu, wymaga refleksji w jednym punkcie. Mianowicie każda reforma i każda zmiana, niezależnie od tego, czy ją wymusza technologia, czy ją wymuszają przepisy, zawsze nieuchronnie jako zmiana niesie ze sobą nie tylko pozytywy, ale i negatywy. Zawsze. To tak jest. I teraz patrzcie Państwo, jak my rozmawiamy. My rozmawiamy o roli teoretycznie państwa. Co państwo powinno zrobić? Co jest obowiązkiem parlamentów, biurokracji, administracji? Zastanowić się w momencie zmian nad tym, jak zapobiec negatywom. Przykład. Sprywatyzowano w Polsce komorników. No tych, którzy egzekwują długi. W związku z tym sprywatyzowani komornicy postanowili podwyższyć swoją produktywność. I podwyższają ją w ten sposób, że zamiast szukać dłużnika, wysyłają tytuły egzekucyjne do wszystkich znalezionych osób o nazwisku i imieniu odpowiadającym nazwisku dłużnika. To jest bardzo produktywne ze strony komorników, bardzo dla nich wygodne i oznacza przerzucenie na Bogu ducha winnych kompletnie w sprawie niezaangażowanych i dług ludzi trud wyszarpania na nowo swojej niezależności od sytuacji, w którą zostali uwikłani. Dlaczego? Ponieważ nikomu nie przyszło do głowy, że prywatyzacja działalności komorników może do takich efektów prowadzić, a w każdym razie, jeżeli do takich efektów prowadzi, powinno natychmiast spotkać się z właściwą i szybką reakcją. To jest jedna kwestia, którą chciałam skomentować. Druga kwestia, która się z tym bezpośrednio wiąże. Otóż problemem nie globalnym, ja się nie znam na globalnej skali, problemem Polski jest to, że w Polsce na skutek istniejących zmian, biurokracji, o której mówiłam, i upadającego poziomu legislacji, nie umiejącej reagować w czas na zagrożenia związane ze zmianami nowoczesności i na skutek prywatyzacji i podwyższenia na skutek tego produktywności działań sprywatyzowanych, dzieje się tak, że coraz bardziej na społeczeństwo przerzuca się trud wyszarpania tego, co i tak to nieduże, marniutkie prawo gwarantuje. Jeżeli teraz państwo mówią, że pada zaufanie społeczne, to ja powiadam, nie dlatego ono pada, że się rozwija technologia, że się zmieniają nam się warunki gospodarowania na przejście, na urynkowienie wielu sfer, ale dlatego, że my zaniedbując usuwanie negatywów związanych z funkcjonowaniem tego, co jest, po prostu nas to nie obchodzi. Polityków nie obchodzi z przyczyn oczywistych. Media są za głupie. Inne osoby, no nie wiem, może nie potrafią też tego zrobić. Wobec tego nam się żyje, w sensie nam, odpowiadam na to, człowiek, który funkcjonuje w obrocie, po prostu trudniej. Ja teraz niedawną swoją jedną publikację zatytułowałam Wirtualizacja prawa do sądu, mając na myśli utrudnienie, przedłużenie w czasie, to właśnie wyszarpywanie, o którym mówię. A co to znaczy dla zaufania społecznego? I teraz, jeżeli w tym punkcie państwo zaniedba swojej roli bufora, wieszcze Armagedonu. Dziękuję.
To ja do pani Joanny Tyrowicz od razu zadam.
Ale jeszcze tylko i później zadajcie koniecznie pytanie, które zadawaliście w tej zajawce. Czy każdy musi mieć etat? Bo ja tu bym chciała.
Właśnie do tego zmierzam i od razu nawet wyjaśnię a propos, czy każdy musi mieć etat, bo to jest pytanie, które pojawiło się takie do rozważenia, sugestia w czasie naszej ostatniej debaty z cyklu, że w zasadzie po 25 latach III RP należałoby oczekiwać, że no jeżeli państwo ma coś zaproponować młodym ludziom, to pojawił się taki głos etat dla każdego. Ja przy tej okazji chciałem zapytać Joannę Tyrowicz o to, z jednej strony oczywiście o pytanie zadane, może warto przynajmniej krótko odpowiedzieć, ale w istocie mnie interesuje ten problem naświetlania realnych problemów, bo właśnie państwo opublikowali ten raport NBP, z którego wyszło dla wszystkich, że rozmowa prowadzona dotychczas o śmieciówkach tak zwanych była przynajmniej, nazwijmy to, obok problemu albo wbrew problemu, albo nie. No, krótko mówiąc, dane, twarde dane, które pani ustaliła, które pani przepracowała z zespołem ludzi, wskazywały na to, że w zasadzie dyskusję należałoby zacząć od nowa. Pojawił się raport i dyskusja w zasadzie przycichła, a w każdym razie nie wybuchła takim ogniem, choć wydawało się przez długie miesiące dyskusji o śmieciówkach, prekariacie i tak dalej, że to jest jeden z najważniejszych tematów relacji młodzi a państwo, prawda? Co wynikło z tego raportu, jakby pani miała to skomentować?
I will be very glad to do that, but first let me just make a slightly malicious comment. One of the issues why we fail to trust the state is that we all the time read in newspapers and everywhere else how the state fails. Reagan failed, Thatcher failed, Gordon Brown failed, everybody failed. Now, the main reason why we read they fail is because people like me do research like we do, and we show these policies don't work. So a part of the problem that we're having, so we have little trust, and this is because we think state fails, and we think the state fails because there is much more money and abilities to do research on whether the state does its job or not. What I deem to say is that in 19th century, where everybody trusted state, nobody did research on whether Bismarckian pension system reform was accurate or inaccurate, and whether it's long-term stable and sustainable. Nobody made an evaluation whether a British reform on public education that guaranteed education to everybody until the age of 12, which was passed, I think, 1913, just before the First World War, whether it was adapted to the needs of people at that time when the labor market needed so many people who could read. B, whether there was enough infrastructure to supply the good that was passed as a bill, and so on, so on. So there's much more people right now than we have seen before that look at law, look at lawmakers, look at policymakers and say, no, you're wrong. And so there's also much more ability to see a conflict, a discussion over which legislation should be passed, whether this one or that one, is that solution correct or not? Maybe we should follow German example, maybe we should follow New Zealand example. This debate is going on, and given that it's very rarely about the merits and very often about what I think about the world, for anybody who stands by that discussion and just looks at 2, 3, 4 heads discussing in TV studio about something, it's almost impossible to formulate their own merit-based opinion. And if they can't have a merit-based opinion, they just follow who they trust. If I like the journalist and I like his suit and his tie, then maybe he's right. And so I'm just going to follow him on other things. And it's not a discussion about whether journalists are doing the job or not, but it's just also that we have much more access to information, which isn't necessarily knowledge. And that's where I think partly one of the problems is. But answering your questions on a job for everybody, are we saying a job for everybody or a job contract for everybody? Job contract. And that's the problem, right? One of the issues to discuss is that, and that's also something you could discuss with the lawyers. They have very interesting views on that. So what is exactly a job contract? We used to think, for example, the entire Polish labor code is founded on the idea that an employer is an independent unit that sets the rules of the employment contract with the employee. Now, that could have been true, say, in 1980s, but right now part of the employers, for example, are foreign-owned firms that do not have decision makers in Poland. They have decision makers in headquarters. If it's decision makers in the headquarters that decide about wage growth and employment level and benefits and everything else, whether a Polish located company that is of course chartered in Poland and everything else, and by Polish law it's an employer, but is that company an employer in terms of a spirit? And obviously the answer to this question is no. So I think just using this example to say that the very idea of an employment contract, as opposed to employment per se, but the very idea of an employment contract is going to be subjected to as radical changes as the ones that we see with the, firms themselves and with the IT and everything involved. My sister, I know it's very wrong to generalize based on a sample that contains one observation, but my sister works for a British company. Her boss is Czech. She's actually employed in Poland by DHL because that company doesn't have any outlets in Poland, and her job is to intermediate between printing houses all over the region, so anywhere between Romania and Estonia, and anybody who wants to print around which can just as well be a Chinese company. I mean, they do print in China because it's cheaper and you don't have to transport as much, but if they wanted to print via my sister's company in a printing house located in Romania, my sister would be the intermediary to broker on that contract. Now, who is her employer? Who is her client? Who is the evaluator of her productivity? And who decides on her job contract? And of course, in terms of law, it all has to be specified because we live in the, let's just say we live in a country ruled by the law. So there has to be a paper signed and somebody who's going to respond to court in case there is any problems. But in practice, the decision-making goes completely independently of whatever is written, like business decision-making, is happening completely independently on what's written on the paper. So we can just take a piece of paper right now. If there was 460 of us, it would even look like a parliament, and we could all sign a document saying an employment contract for everybody. But then the real question would be, what is an employment contract, what it is that we want it to be, and what it can still be in, say, 10 or 25 years from now, which is our individual perspective. I mean, all of us look up until retirement and not the next few years. Most importantly, we should look up until retirement and not the past few years. And much of the discussion about the precarious employment, especially where youth is expressing the views, they are not having the forward-looking perspective. They're having the perspective, I don't want my past to roll over to the future. Well, nobody wants the past to roll over to the future. I mean, ask prisoners if you want their past to roll over to the future. No, everybody has their contract expiring one day, one or another. It's the same thing. So it's just, I mean, this is, when I was a small kid, my parents, when I would make statements like this, like job contract for everybody or stuff, they would say that the depth of this statement is very similar to proletariusze wszystkich krajów łączcie się, which I don't think exists equivalently in English, but I'm sure it can be translated. It's a statement of very similar depth, and that's what I would like to finish. I'll stay here for another quarter, but I will not probably have the opportunity to say anything, so thank you very much for the speech so now.
We'll move to the questions from the audience shortly. Just last question to Professor Anna Giza, because you combine the experiences from, I think, three sides of the story, because now you work as a professor at the university, and we have this controversy at the University of Warsaw now about outsourcing some of the services, whether it's moral or not, or whether university maybe should be a beacon of the employees' rights and should not outsource any of its services. But you also have your experience in the private sector. You worked in the how do you call it, media, or how do you call it, jako badacz, as a researcher. You worked as a researcher.
Not really. I was working.
But my question is, would you like to say on this statement that we had, like job contract for everyone? Because when you work in these three different areas, you have to usually employ people in a different manner.
What is your experience?
What is your experience with that?
But, forgive me, but I will start commenting some issues that were raised before. And now it should work or not? Okay, thanks. So first of all, it's very nice that finally we have come to the issue of ethics or morality, because basically this is something that should be also taken into consideration, and not only efficiency, yeah, and productivity and so on, coming back to your example. But let me start with three remarks, very short. So the first one would be that I totally agree that we have problem, and this problem is more and more urgent, with merit-based opinions. Yeah? Basically, it's more and more difficult for the average person to form merit-based opinion, because there are too many information or too much information, I would even say. After Googling something, you find like 100,000 something and so on and so on. I believe that this is one of the key roles of universities and education, to help people not only to be able to have the competence of analyzing what's available, to have this kind of the critical attitude, to be able to distinguish between merit and something that only looks like merit or is information or is not information, but also to be able to build opinion. This is not that easy, you know, to really come to conviction. Yeah, I think that this is quite a prolonged and quite sophisticated process. And I think that we miss it more and more in our education, and we miss it the more we go into testing system, because testing system is not about building conviction. It's about training certain way of solving problems and nothing more. So this would be the answer of why we need higher education for everybody, yeah, for a kind of the mass education. Then the next point is about this private and public, because what is important is that the more that when the opportunity appears to exit public institution to private that is more efficient, which happens in Poland in health sector, in education sector and other sectors, then in public institutions stay only people who are very weak, who are not resourceful enough to have voice. Yeah, so people who are resourceful and can afford having voice, they rather quit and they go to private sector and they are very happy not to fight for good oncologists and so on and so on. Which means that there is no pressure on public institution to really change and to really become more efficient, more productive, or simply more fair in delivering their services. And I think that this is the side effect of privatization or offering this escape. One of my students made very interesting study on the attitudes of young people towards state. And those attitudes are very rational. What young people say, they say, if my state is not efficient, I will change it. I will go elsewhere. Now we are mobile, which again means that instead of exerting pressure, instead of having that effort to fight for something with my own state, and thus helping public institutions to get better, they just quit, they just go away and so on. So they are very rational. So then the question is, what is the agent to force public institutions, to force state to change? Who stays? Only, I don't know. Yeah, but absolutely, but who is going to have it? I mean, who has resources, voice, time, all other things to invest in this? And of course, we can tell third sector, NGOs are about it, Kultura Liberalna is about it, it's about debating and so on. But maybe public universities, yeah. So, but for me, this kind of the missing hero is something that we should debate about. Then, now, kind of practicing change at public university or public institution. Of course, it's very difficult, but I would like to remind you, because most probably you all know it, a lovely, very short kind of analysis made by Jacek Kuroń. This text is called Modernity and Dignity. And he wrote that text witnessing the negotiation between Lucini and people from steel industry w Huta Warszawa. Yeah? So he was watching what was going on and so on, and he wrote a very lovely and very wise text, Dignity of Modernity. Because, of course, this was about change. People are afraid of changes, and this is quite usual. And I would say, after Jacek Kuroń, that this is our responsibility to help them. And he formulated in this text 4 very simple rules or principles or advices. He said, first of all, if you really want to implement change, you have to find something that people could want, you know. Because the first principle is that people should be positive about the change, and this is your responsibility, said Kuroń, to find that very thing. You cannot impose on people change, saying it will be good for you. I know that you do not want it, but just go for it. If people do not want, they are intelligent enough to bastardize the change and to make it counterproductive. Then the next rule, the next principle formulated by Kuroń was you need to. So first you need to find motivation. Then you need to understand what they are able to do. You can't expect from people that suddenly they will change their behavior next day. Most probably they do not have these competencies, they do not have these skills. And this is again your responsibility to find the way that they can easily and go into that change, using their competencies and their skills as they are at the moment, right now. Then again, you need to make them not be afraid of changes. And this is again the responsibility of the one who is about to introduce the change, because they are entitled to be afraid. You cannot expect from people that they will be not afraid, even that they feel insecure in that situation. But then the most interesting one is the 4th one, because he says they need to know how to make the first step. Because he says very often you tell people, go for it, this is beautiful, this is, yeah. I remember the very first campaign made by famous actors mainly in 1990, I believe. You may remember it or not, you will remember it. This was about encouraging people to support transformation, and you could see those famous actors in TV, and they were saying, jesteśmy wreszcie w naszym własnym domu, nie stój, nie czekaj, pomóż. We are finally in our own home, so do not sit down, do not, just go ahead and help us. And I remember people asking, okay, but what should I do next morning when I am up from my bed? So tell me what is the way ahead. So basically, if we really want to change public institutions, we need to find people who are resourceful, willing, and so on. And then we have to make it not against the institution, but together with this institution, which is very difficult. But otherwise, it will simply not work. So now coming back finally to the very famous moral cleaning of the university, if I remember properly the headline.
We should explain it to our guest.
So the controversy was that the university, for those of you who do not know it, the controversy was that the university outsourced its cleaning services to some other company, and this company employed the people not on job contracts but some other kind of contracts, which and paid them less, almost less than a minimum wage, and so the question was whether university is entitled to do that and should do that, or should be a beacon of employees' rights and should not engage in these practices.
Yeah. There are many sides to this problem. The first one is that we have built, and this is not only our university but also others, absolutely gorgeous modern buildings that any kind of the elderly lady with the bucket is not able to clean. So let me start with this. We need alpinists to clean a lot of surfaces of that kind. So this is to explain why part of cleaning is outsourced at the university in new buildings mainly. But then secondly, we are an institution sitting on the public finance law, which means that we have to how do you call it, ustawa o zamówieniach publicznych? Public tender legislation, which is like it is, and I think that you are aware of all the constraints, so to say. I wonder, I am not sure, we have to check it with the lawyers, whether we can include into famous thieves this kind of expectation toward the companies, because basically this is about intervening, so to say, into their way of running their business. I am not sure we are checking that, because our rector was quite unhappy being put in that situation. But basically, if now we are going back to this very fundamental question, whether university should try to set up and to be a kind of the, how to say it, of the light in the tunnel, yeah. So standing up to the very high moral standards. If you ask me this question, I would say yes. I think that we should, as a university, we should stand up to very high standards. We do in terms of our inner regulations concerning our employees. Now the question is whether we can expect from other companies this kind of behavior.
Let's move to the questions since we... jeszcze pani profesor?
Bardzo przepraszam, ja się postaram bardzo krótko, ale komentarz do tych śmieciówek. Tu jest kilka problemów. I najpierw może od końca, od tej moralnej, od odpowiedzialności i od tego, czego należy pilnować. W tych śmieciówkach, które dotyczą sprzątaczek, pani profesor, to nie w tym jest problem, że one w ogóle to jest outsourcingowane. Problem jest w tym, że te agencje pracują, czego pewnie nie wiecie, w taki sposób, że one tego, co jest i tak umówione, nie płacą. Dlatego była demonstracja przed sądem, co jest uważam za hańbę w Poznaniu, dlatego, że sprzątaczkom to, co było w tych śmieciówkach przyobiecane, nie płacono, bo się później ta agencja rozwiązuje, zawiązuje nowa na bazie tych samych osób, no i tak w kółko. Prezes sądu, notabene w tej chwili wiceszef Krajowej Rady Sądownictwa, powiedział, że skoro umowa nie była zawierana z sądem, to wobec tego nic mu do tej całej sprawy. I wobec tego, jeżeli mówimy o moralności, jeżeli mówimy o prawie, to ja bym odróżniła pomiędzy w ogóle problemem outsourcingu, problem nieprzyzwoitości i niewykonywania tego, co i tak już jest umówione, i problem poziomu argumentacji, że nie obchodzą kogoś, kto jest beneficjentem usług sprzątalniczych, nie obchodzą go warunki, w jakich sprzątaczki nie dostają tego, co im się i tak należy. I to ja nie jest przeciwko outsourcingowi. To jest po prostu przeciwko nieprzyzwoitościom standardu wykonania umów outsourcingowych. Kropka. Drugi problem dotyczący śmieciówek. Chciałabym mieć te problemy, które mają osoby, które mają niejasny status wynikający z globalizacji ich zatrudnienia i problemu, kto jest ich pracodawcą i mózgiem operacyjnym ich sytuacji, jeżeli umowa jest realizowana w globalnej skali. My nie o tym mówimy, bo to są problemy mam wrażenie, i prawniczo rozwiązywalne, i ekonomicznie znacznie łatwiej. Ze śmieciówkami jest problem inny, proszę Państwa. Mianowicie tak zwane zatrudnienie niepracownicze istniało zawsze. Więc to nie jest odpowiedź na pytanie, czy każdy ma mieć etat. Nigdy nikt nie miał każdy etatu, tylko oczywiście statystyka była różna. Natomiast problem jest taki, że stosunek pracy jest związany z pewnym poziomem, zresztą wyznaczanym przez standardy międzynarodowe, MOP, Międzynarodową Organizację Pracy, pakietem ochronnym. I teraz zatrudnienie niepracownicze nie ma tego pakietu ochronnego, ale obowiązek posiadania pakietu ochronnego wynika z Karty Praw Podstawowych, częściowo ona nas tam wiąże, i różnych innych standardów międzynarodowych. I problem leży w tym, że dla umów cywilnoprawnych, śmieciówek, tych niepracowniczych, nikt nie chce w Polsce podjąć dyskusji na temat tego, co dla umów zatrudnienia niepracowniczego wynika z wiążących Polskę umów międzynarodowych, czyli w jakim punkcie to, co się oferuje ludziom na śmieciówkach, odpowiada standardowi międzynarodowemu. Na ten temat nie ma dyskusji. Ani w prawie pracy specjalnie. Nie, wyszła książka Anny Musiały. Zatrudnienie niepracownicze, pierwsza, spotkała się z różnymi kontrowersjami, dlatego obawiam się, że ona była trochę zbyt, sam problem się wydawał niedostatecznie naukowy kolegom pracusiom, specjalistom prawa pracy. No, zostawiam to poza tematem. Otóż, proszę Państwa, i teraz Państwo pytają o remedia. Ano niech każdy robi to, co do niego należy. To znaczy, media niech o tym piszą, bo jeżeli są, czy przychodzą do rektora Pałysa, może głupio, może kłopotliwie, ale powiedzieć, nie przynosi chluby uniwersytetowi ta cała relacja. Nie przynosi chluby sądownictwu demonstracja pod sądem. Niech sądy, jak robić? Krytykować. Ja krytykuję w tej chwili sądy. Dalej. Wymaga niestety, rzeczowa krytyka wymaga wiedzy. Wciągnijcie trochę prawników do tej dyskusji. Dlatego, że to, że wam radca prawny powie, że wasze umowy są cudowne, to ja bym specjalnie radcy prawnemu nie wierzyła. Dziękuję.
To ja tylko dodam, zaraz przechodzimy od razu do pytań, że Adrian Wooldridge w swojej książce sugeruje też, że idąc w tym tropem rozumowania, pani profesor Tyrowicz jeszcze nam podpowiedziała, że ten rynek pracy będzie się tak zmieniał, że te formy zatrudnienia dotychczasowe będą musiały być bardziej elastyczne, ponieważ no, wymagać będzie to dostosowania choćby do zmieniającego się sposobów zarobków, tak, które w przeciągu kilku lat no, brawurowo się zmieniły. Tak? Więc to jest jakby coś rzeczywiście takie spojrzenie do tyłu. Rozmowa o umowach o pracę, jakkolwiek może być pełna szlachetnych intencji, w istocie nie jest rozmową do przodu, w jaki sposób my będziemy zmieniający się rynek, będzie musiał również uwzględniać zmieniające się umowy, które będą związane z tym zatrudnieniem.
Po prostu instrumenty prawne, jak je zaadaptować do tej sytuacji. Instrumenty są i w prawie międzynarodowym, i u nas też by były, gdyby za przeproszeniem, jak w Szwejku, ktoś tego gulaszu zażądał.
Dobrze. So we're gonna have, I think, 2 or 3 questions, and because we ran out of time, obviously, which we thought we will. But then our speakers will stay, I hope, with us for at least 15 minutes to answer all the questions that you didn't manage to ask publicly. So we have 1, 2, and 3. 4. 3. I said 3.
Można po angielsku i po polsku.
So thank you very much. This has been a very interesting discussion, but I have been sitting and listening with great attention, and the thing that surprised me a lot was that you actually, all of your speeches and comments were very interesting, but I didn't think you were actually discussing with one another. There were 4 interesting perspectives. From these 4, Adrian's perspective is somehow totally different. Perhaps the reason, my hypothesis would be that, as you perhaps know, this a scandal with tapes in Poland, the tapes that contained some discussions of the Polish politicians. When we heard the tapes, we actually found out that there was almost nothing very much scandalous on the tapes, but one of the prominent politicians on the regarded this discussion conversation, he said that Polish state exists only theoretically. And people were really furious about it, that the minister of Polish government says this. The point is that perhaps the difference in your comments comes from the fact that the British state doesn't exist only theoretically, whilst Polish state perhaps exists, but it was for the past 25 years created ad hoc. And so we have a lot of flaws, and we are very deeply aware of them, and perhaps we are a little bit lost in where we start reforming this state. So this is one the comment. And the question goes to Adrian. I just wanted to ask, when the Occupy movements started, there were many people that said that actually the new technology, as you, Adrian, said, the empowerment of the individual that comes from the iPad, from the device, that this empowerment will actually change the politics, and Occupy movements will change the politics. Well, from the past, from this perspective of these few years, we all know that this hasn't happened. So, have I understood correctly that your idea, your hypothesis is that technology, internet, devices, will actually also change the state? Because if the politics weren't changed, why do we think that the technology will also change, will change the state? Isn't it, to make a paraphrase of Yevgeny Morozov's net delusion, isn't it a technology delusion? Thank you.
Dobry wieczór. Mnie tutaj może nie za bardzo widać, ale może będzie słychać dobrze. Ja bym chciał troszeczkę odwrócić pytanie i zapytać może nie, co jest nie tak z państwem, ale może, znaczy z państwem jako, nie z państwem, tak, tylko co może jest nie tak z nami, co się z nami stało nie tak. Czy nie jest troszeczkę tak, że z biegiem lat i dekad nasze oczekiwania wzrosły i ciągle wzrastają, a z drugiej strony to, co chcemy od siebie dawać, pozostaje takie samo bądź wręcz maleje. I ewentualnie w związku z tym, czy jedyną tak naprawdę, jedyną tą złą rzeczą, którą państwo w tym wszystkim zrobiło i o co państwo możemy obwiniać, to, że z jednej strony dało nam poczucie tego, że możemy coraz więcej oczekiwać, a z drugiej strony nie nauczyło nas tego, albo przestało nas uczyć tego, jak się angażować, poza tym, że oczywiście każe nam płacić podatki.
Ja powinienem to zrobić na początku. Czy może się pan przedstawić i zaadresować pytanie konkretnie do konkretnego panelisty?
Nazywam się Tomasz Krzywański i nie miałem specjalnie pomysłu, komu zadać to pytanie, bo każdy z panelistów na pewno ma ciekawą odpowiedź na to pytanie, więc kto będzie miał ochotę, to odpowie.
Dobrze, dziękujemy.
Ostatnie pytanie.
I have a question to Adrian as well. Thank you for coming here. And so you said that the state should shrink. I wonder, like, what are the core functions you think should remain within the state's responsibilities? So that's the first question. And then the second question is about changing education. You said, like, I can see the best lecture in the world, and so I basically read this as I don't really need my local university anymore. I can just go and look, for example, at classes from Stanford. So whether my interpretation is right, or maybe you still see some role of local universities, and what would be that role? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
ostatnie, tam pan chciał zadać pytanie?
Ale nie wiem gdzie.
Tu.
Being very brief, you characterize...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name's Simon Loeb. I'm a, regular guy.
Great.
You characterized a few centuries of political economic development through Hobbes, John Stuart Mill. 2 centuries were covered by the welfare state, and then you positioned in the contemporary time frame China, and no other example. And I wonder if you could elaborate, maybe not on the whole chain, but at least on what you see as the underpinnings of China's success, and whether you think that success is genuine and sustainable. Oh, I should have said, I'm not a regular guy. I just came back from China, so I know a lot about the topic.
Thank you very much.
We're gonna probably let the panelists answer, and then 2 or 1 minute comment to sum up the discussion. So we're going to start with Adrian.
The technology illusion. I think that technology is changing politics fundamentally, or by which I mean that the politics that we have is rooted in a very different world from the one that we live in. It's rooted in the world of big political parties, big companies, stable employment. That is all dissolving, and what you're seeing across Europe is the rise of radical parties, small parties, or the collapse, the dying of the big political parties. So in Britain, for example, the Conservative Party had 3 million members in 1950. It now has 130,000 members. These big political parties are dying, and what we're going to see is a big change in politics. The technology illusion, I think that these technologies do provide extraordinary platforms for delivering public services better and more efficiently with less labour. But I don't think it's enough just to have the technological revolution. You also have to have a philosophical revolution. We have to go back to this question, what is the state for? Should the state be doing what it's doing? So it's not enough just to deliver existing services better. You also have to ask, should the state be doing what it's doing? And what we've seen throughout the last 50 years or more is relentless pressure from both the right and the left to tell the state to do more. More law and order, more regulation, more job security. And I think that that's got well beyond the point of diminishing returns. And let me give you one example of something the state ought not to be doing. In the United States now, that supposedly liberal country, the United States, it takes 2 years of training to get a license to be an interior decorator, to operate as an interior decorator. I think that whatever the state should be doing, it shouldn't be concerned with whether you have clashing colour schemes or not. And I think there are all sorts of ways. 25% of all professions in the United States are regulated by licenses. You have to have licenses. So the state, through regulation and through specific action, has been doing all sorts of things that it should not be doing. Now, that brings me neatly to the second point, which is us, expectations. I think it's not just a bunch of evil politicians who've been bribing us, although politicians are evil and they do bribe, but it's also our expectations. I think people have unrealistic expectations of government. They want more for less. They want the government constantly to be delivering the more. And that's created a very peculiar sort of democratic distemper. What's happened over the last few decades is that the amount of things that the bids and promises have relentlessly increased, and popular feelings about government and about politicians have got more and more negative. So we have this strange position in which we want government to do more, then we complain about what it gives us, and then by complaining we say you must do more, and then it does more and we complain more and more. So I think that one of the things that could re-legitimize the state is precisely this notion of focusing on a few things, doing less, promising less, but doing what it should do, providing public goods like education, healthcare and things like that, doing them better, but not regulating many, many things that it shouldn't. So shrink to the core functions. I think that will create legitimacy. On the China question, which is a fascinating question, is in many ways the biggest question of our time. Is the China model sustainable? I remember going to China and talking to an activist there, and he listed to me all the things that were wrong about China: the pollution, the corruption, the fact that the companies were quite often rent seekers, listed. And he said, I said, God, this is appalling. How long do you think it's got to go? He said, oh, it's going to collapse any day now. I wouldn't give it more than 70 years. And I think that that's basically my notion of China. I think that ultimately this authoritarian model can't go on. Ultimately, you have to move towards a more democratic system. But it's going to be challenging us for a long time, because what they have done is to develop a model of autocracies die because autocrats get old and mad, or because they give power to their children, who are stupid and deranged, or because, like the socialist system, they try and control the whole economy. It doesn't work. What you have in China is an interesting combination of markets and state direction. So you have a lot of the dynamism of the market. And as I said earlier, the circulation of elites. So these elites stay in power for 10 years and then they move on. A very odd thing in human history. So I think China has a real capacity to regenerate itself or survive. And ultimately, it can't last, but ultimately it's a long time away. In the long term, you know, that'll change. And what's happened, I believe, over the last few years is that democracies, the United States and the European Union in particular, have been doing very badly at governing themselves. They're no longer the beacons that they were. They're more of a beacon in Poland than they are elsewhere. But we've seen in the United States a government that cannot pass a budget, that cannot get its entitlements under control, that is essentially paralyzed, dominated by interest groups, dominated by veto groups. We are quite likely to see in the United States a presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. That doesn't tell us much about the health of democracy in the United States. On the other hand, in the European Union, we had the biggest political decision, perhaps in many ways one of the worst political decisions of the post-war era, which was to create the common currency, the euro, without any democratic discussion, any democratic input whatsoever. We've seen Berlusconi, who is a buffoon and an idiot, but we saw him sacked, essentially removed, without any democratic election, and replaced by a technocrat. That was an extraordinary thing to do. And I think if you're in the emerging markets, if you're in Africa, you don't look at Europe and you don't look at America and say, this is the beacon of tomorrow. You say, these are deeply dysfunctional places. So I'd like us to recover our capacity to make good, sensible public policy decisions in order to revitalize democracy and liberalism.
Dziękujemy. Pani profesor?
Ja może odpowiem na pytanie pana. Oczywiście, że to tak jest, jak pan mówi. Nas zetknęła transformacja ze światem, zwłaszcza ukształtowanym na podstawie Europejskiej Konwencji o ochronie podstawowych praw człowieka, wolności i praw człowieka, w taki sposób, że tam jako standard, zwłaszcza mam na myśli standard ochrony sądowej, jest ochrona efektywna. Co ma ten skutek, że jeżeli ochrona jest nieefektywna, ten nasz komornik, który rozsyła nie wiadomo gdzie, albo ochrona jest nieefektywna dlatego, że państwo zaniedbało we właściwy sposób zorganizować system pomocy prawnej, to jest odpowiedzialność państwa. I myśmy w te oczekiwania uwierzyli. Tylko zapomnieliśmy o jednym, że system Strasburga to jest ten system do korygowania małych ekscesów życia, które normalnie kształtuje się w miarę zbliżonego do tego, który jest standardem zachodnim. My jesteśmy newcomerzy. No więc dlatego to jest właśnie taka sytuacja o tym standardzie, że odstajemy tym standardem. Teraz, czy państwo odpowiada za to, że nas źle wychowało? Nie. Każdy odpowiada sam za siebie. Natomiast ja powtarzam i powtarzam raz jeszcze. Kompetencje organów państwowych mają tę cechę, że istnieje nie tylko prawo, ale i obowiązek ich wykonywania. Polska ma wieloletnią tradycję braku egzekucji praw. To jest nasz problem, który zapoznają media, bo nie wiedzą, jak się do tego wziąć, który jest na rękę biurokracji, która nie chce sobie łamać głowy pilnowaniem wykonywania kompetencji. A my siedzimy i biadolimy, że nam w Konstytucji nie zapisano szczęśliwości ogólnej.
Dziękujemy. Pani profesor?
Tak, jestem ostatnią przeszkodą na drodze do kolacji, czy do herbaty, czy do czegoś innego.
Ale prosimy.
Mimo to, znaczy, No, co tu można powiedzieć więcej? Maybe I should switch into English just to make it more effective, maybe. So basically, I would only like to refer to what was mentioned about our responsibility for the state. Because basically, and I would like very much to stress the value or the importance of what Joanna said, that the more we are talking about the failure of the state and the distrust and so on, the more we give alibi to all people who are very happy to say in this country there is not possible to this, do and that. And I think that this is also our responsibility as journalists, as media, as elites of the society, to also think about the social consequences of what we are talking about. So I agree with you. So this is also on our side, because basically, coming back to Seneca, I believe, he said that a state is the I can't quote from memory, but that state is a society of people linked by law. So I think this is the best definition of the state, which means that we are the state. And of course, law is badly designed and not executed. But then I am back to my old question about the dilemma of the missing hero. So who is going to address those issues? If we are giving alibi to people saying, well, forget about this country. I have to say that I hate this expression, and I am especially sensitive toward it, and listen carefully to public discourse. Almost everybody now is saying in this country, w tym kraju, z tym społeczeństwem, z tymi ludźmi, z tym państwem, z tym prawem, and so on, which is very, very dangerous.
So the technology itself is not going to save us. We still need people to use it, basically.
To w naszym kraju zdarzają się debaty, które są na tyle interesujące, że pozostaje po nich niedosyt. A zatem, proszę Państwa, z tym niedosytem zostajemy i chciałbym podziękować naszym gościom. Adrian Wooldridge, pani profesor Ewa Łętowska i pani profesor Anna Giza, i dziękuję za pytania, za Państwa obecność i do zobaczenia przy okazji następnej debaty. Do widzenia, dobranoc. Dziękuję pięknie. Dziękuję bardzo.
Ja nie idę na kolację, bo ja nie mam siły. Naprawdę nie mam siły. Ja pracuję od 9 rano. Słyszę pan, co się dzieje. Ja dziękuję, idę do domu, bo ja też. No to brawo.
Ale ciekawa prawda rozmowa. Nie zjechała nam się. Trzeba nic nie robić.